guys, and welcome back to another episode of In the Barn. I'm Robin.
And I'm Kelsey, and in today's episode, we're going to discuss the equine attention span. Just how long should we expect our horses to engage with us during a training session? Do they need time to digest what they learned? And is their memory really as short as a goldfish's? Hey guys, don't forget to check out last week's episode where we update you on all our horses and what we've been doing with them and why we wouldn't trust the us of 2 years ago to handle our horses now. Of course, if you are enjoying these episodes, don't forget to leave us a review on the Apple Podcast app or swing by our Instagram page at inthebarn.pod, where we post regular photos of our four-leggeds and share some more science and more knowledge as we learn and grow. So I was just going to start off by sharing how we even got to this topic this week, because it's not interesting at all.
All right, then let's hear it.
No, I have a bunch of like really old Equus magazines that my mom used to like subscribe to Equus for us, and we were supposed to read them. And this was like 2007 was the magazine I was looking at, so I would have been 16, and I definitely wasn't reading anything my mom bought and like set in front of us. I just was not very, I didn't have enough of an attention span at that age to sit down and read.
Ironically enough.
Right? To read these articles. Oh my gosh, that wasn't even a pun. That just happened.
Man, I don't have the attention span to read about my horse's attention span.
Well, I have some really good like kind of questions to ponder that we're going to discuss at the end, because the horse's brain is designed very differently than the humans. And so attention span, what is our definition of an attention span? Like what my attention span and what human brains are designed to do is not the same thing horse brains are designed to do. Therefore, we should not expect the same level of attention from a horse that we would from a human. And this is where we start to see some clashes when you're riding. You know, we are all guilty of like getting really sucked into fixing an issue and just wanting to like pick at it, because that's what a human brain is designed to do. It's designed to kind of throw out a lot of, like miss a lot of distractions, a lot of things that are occurring, and just concentrate on one task and really kind of dig into that task. That's not what a horse brain is designed to do. This discussion about their attention spans, I think, is really important, but we also have to define what is an attention span. Like what do we mean by that? And I don't have an answer. That's for the group. That's for society to figure out, what do we mean when we want our horses to pay better attention?
One of the studies I was looking at, oh gosh, I don't remember what it was called now. They were breaking it down when they were looking at the horses. They were trying to get a measure of like our general definition when we think of attention span, how long horses would focus on a single dot on a stall door. And when they move it around, they were trying to see how long they would focus. If they did this over multiple days, would they continue to focus with like the same level of attentiveness? And they were kind of breaking up the horse's attention span into 4 different parts. They had selective attention, which maintained like the same behavior in the presence of a distracting stimuli. They had like divided attention, which was the ability to like respond to multiple different stimuli or like across multiple different tasks. They had like sustained attention, which was the ability to maintain consistent behavioral responses during continuous activity. And alternating attention, which was the ability to shift the focus of attention and move between tasks. And I actually really like this because they address that not all attention, like attention span is such a generic term that it doesn't actually address how your horse, because when you think of the 3-second rule we were all taught, that we interpret as the horse can only maintain information for 3 seconds before it's no longer relevant and they no longer understand what like you're either punishing them for or rewarding them for. And yet we kind of discard this rule. We throw it out the window when we're riding them, and we go for 30-minute long rides, and we expect the horse to maintain what we worked on at the very beginning of the ride all the way until the end.
Right. And that, you know, because they are prey animals, they have to be kind of constantly paying attention to what's going on around them. They cannot just hone in on a laser dot or an English lecture or, you know, your goal in your lesson. They have to be paying attention so that they stay alive. And so they are constantly, their ears are better than ours, their eyes are better than ours, their smell is better than ours, and they're paying attention to all of these different senses while we're trying to teach them something. They're going to get distracted. They're going to see things that you don't see because that's how their brain is designed to function, and we shouldn't be holding that against them or punishing them because they get distracted.
Well, I was also reading something that says horses' eyes, oh no, I'm so going to butcher this. I didn't write it down or anything. I like briefly read it and I was like, oh, cool, noted. But it was where they were talking about horses' eyes. They can see way more movement in anything than we can see.
That makes sense though, right? Because they're looking for a lion or a cougar or something to jump on them at any second.
Oh, their life sounds... And now it's valid that my horse is always scared of like her shadow.
I had that exact experience today where I was working with Hudson. We were off in the arena. Ben was in the backyard. And as far as I was concerned, out of sight. He was not out of sight to Hudson. Hudson was very aware of him and had to stop and stare and take it all in. It was like... I don't see it. I know what's going on. I don't see it. But that's, the boogeyman, right? Is that there's always something hiding in the bushes that your horse sees. And that has to do with how their brain is designed as a prey animal. And you can't train that out of them. You have to just accept it and understand how to work with it. Do you want to start with your laser dot study? Because that one actually sounds really interesting.
So that's the one that I didn't really take any notes on or write down very much. It was called A Novel Test for Evaluating Horses' Spontaneous Visual Attention is Predictive of Attention in Operant Learning Tasks. And this was published in July 2017. And they reference a lot the study that we both covered that was done back in 2007, 2004. They referenced theirs and were like, while that study was great, it wasn't very... it wasn't very easy to repeat with a lot of different horses in their own environments. And so what they were doing was they took, I think it was 12 different mares that they had in a stall. And each one they would go in, put the halter on them, bring them around, lead them to face the front of the stall. And then they would just put the lead rope over their neck so the handler wasn't interfering with the horse. And the horse was either interacting with the dot on the wall on their own free will or ignoring it, and no one was going to redirect them. They were just going to do this one dot. And what they would do was they bring the horses around to look at it. And then they would press the little laser dot, put it on the wall, and the handler would move the dot around on the wall in a certain pattern. And they ended up measuring across 3 different days. They measured how often the horses would look at it and just have their sole focus on it. They also measured how long it took for horses to actually pay attention to it and engage with that dot. They noted the horses that would take a step towards it. And they noted that not necessarily as like an increase in attention, but they noted that as those were like the more curious horses that went to investigate and see what's this green dot doing on my wall. They did it across 3 different days. And then 6 months later, they came back and did the same study to see how much of it the horses retained and if the horses would still be just as interested in the dot 6 months later after seeing it the first time. And it's kind of funny because one of the mares that they used in this study, she never once did she give attention to the dot. All the other horses eventually gave their attention to the dot and focused on it for anywhere around 6 to 28 seconds. But the one mare, she never looked at it, just completely dismissed it. Doing this laser dot on the wall in this pattern is a great way that you can figure out your own horse's attention span and how often your horse is willing to interact with spontaneous stimuli, which I thought was really cool because how many of us have a wall with our horses that we could just stand them in front of and put a laser dot on it and see how long it takes them to notice it? Are they intrigued? Are they going to go check it out? And then how long before our own horses disengage? And what they were really saying with their study was they were trying to figure out a way to measure a bunch of different horses because based off of these 12 mares they were testing, they had such different varying results that they're like, it truly is, yes, there's an average time, but it truly is down to each individual horse and their own specific attention span.
Yeah, and that is similar to what that 2007 study, the measurement of attention time in the horse, that is similar to what they found, is that each horse is really unique in their attention. It's really going to depend on them. There's not a general 3 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 minutes. It's specific to each horse.
Yeah, so what they ended up finding was that the overall attention across 5 minutes was how long the laser beam was on, and they were moving it in the pattern repeatedly. And they found across this 5 minutes, the overall attention, average time the horses would pay attention to the laser dot out of that total 5 minutes was 45 seconds. The one mare, she only paid attention to it for 8 seconds out of that whole 5 minutes. And then another mare, she paid attention to it for 172 seconds.
Okay.
So one of them was very engaged, while the other couldn't care less that this dot was on her wall.
Did they note the age of those 2 horses? Was one a younger horse and one an older horse? Or
they did not, but the age range it was from, they had a 5-year-old, and I think the oldest one was in their 20s. They also had a few 12 to 15.
Okay.
But so for fixed attention, the average time, 12 seconds. 12 to 16 seconds was their average. The maximum time that one of the mares fixed their attention on the dot for a continuous attention span was 56 seconds, and the minimum amount of time was 0, which was the one mayor who was like, could care less. So it just showed like how big of a different range there was between these horses. But I thought it was really cool that, one could care less while the other was able to focus for almost an entire minute on this one dot.
This has been a very interesting dot.
I really liked that study. I liked how they did it and that I could repeat this with my own horses, that I don't have to have a crazy setup, a crazy way of measuring them, that I could just take my horse into the stall and just see how long she was willing to give this dot her attention across like a couple minutes. I would repeat it exactly how they did it in this study and just get an idea for how long my horse is actually able to pay attention to something.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be curious because the difference between Trin and Fletch or any of my horses, I'm sure is huge, that there's going to be a winner. Should we take bets on who you think the winner will be? Who has the longest attention span?
Oh, yes. It is not Trin. Trin is lost already.
I think it's going to be Nim, only because he's going to freeze and panic. He's going to be like, ah, there's a dot in my stall. I can't imagine Addie would be very interested. Because, like, to me, I feel like my horse would just be like, that's not a thing. That's just a light. Like, that, to me, that's the mare that didn't pay attention, was like, guys, it's not real. Where I feel like the younger horses are like Hudson and Nim would believe it was a real thing.
Oh, another thing I was actually going to mention about this study, and they totally bring it up and talk about it, is that the reason they did it this way versus the study that you're going to talk about that was done, it didn't require training. That was a big thing, was that this test of their attention span didn't require the same intensive training that the study did in 2007. It didn't require them to be trained to do anything. It didn't require the horse to be listening for specific cues. It didn't require any of that. It was just seeing based on no previous experience. It was a spontaneous dot that appeared on the wall, moved in a pattern that was continuous. And that's what, like, it makes it so interesting to me. We could replicate it.
Yeah. No, and that whole concept of training for these experiments is definitely something we're going to dive into in a future episode. We are planning to do an ethics of the ethics of research and kind of talk a little bit more about how these tests, how they get horses, how they pay for them, how funding works, but also how these tests are set up. Because there's actually, I read a very interesting review that I'm going to share some snippets with you guys at the end. But the training component and how these tests are set up is super flawed, unfortunately. That one of the biggest ways these tests are conducted, test after test after test, is positive reinforcement. Most horses are not trained with positive reinforcement. So that there skews your standard. Like, whatever information you're going to get from it is if you're using a totally different training method.
Yeah, and the study that I was just talking about with the laser dot, they didn't
have to train.
Yeah, it wasn't a reward-based thing. It was just seeing how long they could pay attention to this dot. There was nothing else involved.
The laser dot, I thought was really interesting. I didn't find that study. I looked for a ton of it. Like, I found this 2007 study, and then I read through a bunch of studies from blink rate being an indication of how much the horse is focused, but that got really controversial, and that's a whole other shebang. And then I had a bunch of maze tests, but then that got into learning theory, and it was more than just attention span. So I'm glad you found that laser dot study, because I was really struggling to find a study besides this 2007 one that looked at attention span.
It was frustrating that a lot of the ones that were looking at attention span were looking at attention span based off of operant conditioning, so using positive reinforcement.
But then they turned that into the learning behavior and looking more not just at the potential for the horse, like not just their attention span, but then taking that further to what kind of learning and how smart basically were these horses. Like, I found a study about mares versus geldings, that geldings have a lot better visual spatial awareness, so they can see something and remember where it is. So that gelding who always spooks at the same spot every single day probably remembers something that the mare's already forgotten about. But that, isn't, that's not attention span. Actually, and that little fact, that little tidbit, pretty much all males of any species have better visual spatial awareness than the female of the species. And it's theorized that has to do with kind of like a primal instinct to be the providers for that pack or that herd, that they need to remember where certain things are that maybe the females in the herd don't have to remember. Really interesting, but not attention span. So the other study that we mentioned a couple times was one that I actually found referenced in that 2007 Equus magazine. And this is the measurement of the attention time in the horse. And the article was how long is your horse's attention span in Equus magazine. So this one, as we mentioned, was in French. I did run a big chunk of it through Google Translate, which takes time. And as isn't always perfect. So I'm going to try to do my best to summarize what I found in Google Translate. But if I did mess it up, again, it wasn't in English. So I'm doing my best here. So essentially, this study concluded that horses' attention span was about 3 minutes. How they got to that 3 minutes is kind of confusing and super vague because I did not find them in the study anywhere mentioning 3 minutes. However, this Equus article that was written in 2007 mentions the 3 minute thing. That a horse, basically what the study was finding, and I'll explain how it was set up in a second, was that horses could focus on the specific task for about 3 minutes before they failed the task and were no longer like able to move on. And that's how they determined that horses could focus for on average 3 minutes. But that they're each horses, but that nowhere in the study did they come out and say 3 minutes that I could find. And in fact, they kind of said the opposite, that the total attention span of a horse is in fact greater than that taken into account in the study. The test repeated 3 weeks later could be performed without new learning proof of memory. So that is a snippet if we believe Google Translate. So what this test did was they had 49 horses. So yay, a statistically relevant sample.
Yes.
Unfortunately, once you get that high, a lot of the studies are filled with math. So in this test, each horse was taught to respond to an audible cue. And I don't know what that cue was, but it was some type of noise, whether it was like a bell or a clicker. They would hear that noise and then they'd have to touch a target. So if you're familiar with positive reinforcement training, that sound comes after they do the task. In this case, the sound came before, and then they heard that cue and had to touch the target. And I don't think it was a spoken word. It was like a repeatable sound that you couldn't mess up. The horse has to go through a preconditioning phase. They have to learn the cue. Once the horses, all 49, learned the cue, then the test could start. So basically, I'm going to call them levels. The horses had to go through different levels, and the levels started at 3 seconds. So that 3 seconds was before the next cue happened. So then they had to go 4 seconds before they heard the next cue, then 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, and up to 70. One horse made it up to 70 seconds, was the longest time he was able to wait. So basically, he would hit the target, wait 70 seconds without being distracted, without walking away, without checking something else out, and then asked again. So just one horse made it to 70 seconds, and that same horse only made it to 30 seconds in test 2, which was two weeks later. They also don't mention what age group that horse fell into, but they did break these horses into age groups in order to see if age played a factor at all. They found that the younger horses did really well in test 1. They had the better scores and were on average able to wait about 20 seconds between each cue. But they found that the older horses, and by younger, I think it was 3 to 7 was the young horses, 8 to 14 was the middle. And then the older horses were the 15 to 23. And so they did better on the second test, but they were more consistent. So they found that horses between 15 and 23 were more likely to have the same attention span every single time, which I don't know that I have that number written down. It wasn't very high. They were not, I think they were average closer to like 10 seconds, where the 3 to 7-year-olds were like 20 seconds on the first try. So what this study found, again, surprise, surprise, horses are individual, and each horse's attention span is going to vary and is unique to them. The attention span, so the average time horses could wait, the total group was 11.8 seconds for the first test. So that's 11 seconds on average. Everyone could wait and focus on the trainer before hearing the next cue. And then the second test was 10.7 seconds. So they did worse the second time. And basically, a horse had to get the question correct 3 times, and it could move on to the next level, or get the question wrong 5 times, and then he was done. He couldn't move on any more levels, and he was retired for the day. So basically, back to that 3-minute piece, that 3 minutes was most horses, regardless of what level they made it to, it was about 3 minutes before they failed. So maybe they got really quickly through the first couple levels and then got hung up lower down. I don't really know how that measurement worked, but while the Equus article mentions 3 minutes, that 3 minutes didn't exist as far as I could find in the study. And in Equus's defense, it does appear that they actually interviewed someone in regards to this test. And let's see if I can see his last name is Rappin, but I don't know who Rappin is. If that was someone who actually conducted the test, or...
He's clearly a rapper, because he's always rapping.
Actually, biologist Veronica, so I know how to pronounce Veronica Rapin, and I'm sure it's like Rapin or Rapine or something like that. It's just a biologist.
I was reading it as Rapine.
Rapine? Okay, maybe it's Rapine. Wait, did she do the actual test, or is she just like speaking on behalf of people involved? Because it just says that she's a biologist.
She was involved with the test.
So she's the one that they quote with the 3 minutes. So she says 3 minutes in this Equus article, but I don't see that 3 minutes in the study, so I don't know where it came from. Also, it was in French. I may have missed a sentence. Like, I don't. I was running it through Google Translate. But back to that conclusion statement, was that they don't believe that this test showed anything. That, like, the horse's attention span was probably greater than that 11.8 seconds or that 10.7 seconds.
So I think out of all the studies that we're looking at and reading through, I was having a hard time putting this all into words or just articulating it. And I think the hang up that we're kind of coming with all these studies is that when they're looking at the horse's attention span, most of them are just measuring a horse's continuous attention span. Where isn't it in like people, our continuous attention span is ridiculously low. It's, you have like 5 seconds before people get bored and tune out of something. And I think that's kind of what they're looking at with horses, is that continuous. How long do they look at it before that horse needs to reset?
Well, so that goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, is that, so this comes from a 2018 Equus article by Janet Jones, who is a PhD, and it's called Capture Your Horse's Attention. So she states in that 2018 article, in horses and humans, attention refers to many different skills. Equine brains are engineered for vigilance. They notice new sights and sounds, identify changes, switch focus from one item to another, and evaluate for danger, all at a lightning speed. Human brains are much less vigilant, but they're better at ignoring distractions and concentrating on lengthy tasks. So that goes back to we just sit down and focus on something and try to ignore what else is going on. Doesn't mean we're always good at it. But have you ever heard of the gorilla in the basketball court experiment?
No. What is this?
Okay, so it's a YouTube video. You should have someone set it up for you.
Oh, you mean when the kids are playing I thought this was a gorilla playing basketball.
No. This is with the kids playing basketball, and you're supposed to count the number of times the basketball is passed.
And then, like, there's a moonwalking gorilla in the middle.
Correct. And hardly anyone ever sees the gorilla because human brains are trained to focus on that one task, count the passes, and blinders on to all the other information. That's the opposite of horses' brains. Horses' brains don't focus on one thing. And that's why, these experiments that look at their attention spans is really challenging because horses don't just focus on one thing. Laser one was interesting because when they broke it down into 4 different types of attention span, that's much more accurate for a horse versus a human, where I don't feel like the French study really clearly showed that there's a difference between horse and human attention spans.
Yeah, and I was reading, it wasn't another study, but it was another article that talked about kind of how we keep comparing, or these different studies, how people keep taking a horse's results and comparing them across either different animals or comparing them to the results of human studies, and how it's hindering horses' welfare, and we're making all these incorrect assumptions, or making all these like incorrect conclusions because we're treating their brain like it's a different animal. We're not treating them as though they are horses. We're taking the horse and trying to see how they match up to all these different animals and how their performance compares to either a dog, a cat, or a person. And like the two are not the same. And that's like, it's hindering how we look at horses, how we train horses. It's a hindrance.
Yes. And this is something that, it goes into our discussion on the ethics of this research, is that, they're constantly trying to figure out which is like the smartest animal. And it goes back to that meme you see all the time on Facebook, where it's like a bunch of animals in a row in front of like a panel of judges. And the question is like, climb the tree. And you've got a monkey, you've got a fish, you've got a dog, right? You've got all these different animals. And you're going to be judged on how well you can climb that tree. But that's not how learning behavior works. There's different types of things you can learn, and there's different, one of the reviews. So I found this review, and they were talking about how horses can't learn feed aversion. So dogs are really good at feed aversion. Horses cannot figure it out. So a dog will stop eating something it thinks will make it sick. A horse will not. But that doesn't mean a horse is stupid. And that doesn't mean you can take what you find in a dog study and apply it to horses, because their brains don't work. They're not developed the same way. So they learn different things and are better at different things. And it's that Facebook meme where you're trying to apply the same criteria to a bunch of animals or back and forth. We talk about how memory in humans is developed, right? You have to build up that neuron pathway. And you have to repeat that habit over and over and over, that task over and over and over before that neuron pathway is thick enough that it becomes a habit. Well, we don't really know if that's true in horses either. There's a lot of I was reading something from 2007, so my apologies if we are a little bit more updated now. But the understanding back in 2007 of how horses' memory works, that was a question mark. We don't know that horses' memories, because sticking them in an MRI machine or anything that can scan their brain is kind of challenging.
Sticking them in the MRI and being like, stand still, honey.
Right? Don't panic. This machine's going to go around your head. Here's some calming music. Enjoy. But a lot of those things with horses and how their brains work is just not as well understood as we might think or hope it is.
Well, I also read another study that was done. It was published back in January 2004, so once again, quite a while ago. And it was called The Short-Term Spatial Memory in Domestic Horses, where they were looking at, it's kind of hard to understand exactly how they did it, but essentially they investigated the ability of horses to recall a feeding event where the horses made a choice between two different feeding concepts. One option was that the horse would receive immediate release. And in the study, they repeated this over 40 times. And then after that, they would receive a second option, which was delivery of food, and the release of the food would occur after 10 seconds. And they repeated that over, I think it was 40 more times or something of the nature. And what they found in the results was that the immediate release trials were a lot more successful. And in fact, the 10 seconds, if the horse had to wait 10 seconds for their reward or the release of food, it was quite unsuccessful. And they started kind of making these conclusions, or I guess questioning that maybe horses don't possess a perspective type of memory. And perspective memory involves remembering to perform a planned action or recall a planned intention. So it's something like remembering to take your medication at night or remembering to deliver a message to a friend. They started to draw the conclusion that horses don't necessarily have that type of memory.
Which makes sense, because horses don't have frontal lobes, and that frontal lobe is where you connect thought, and you make those deeper interpretations, and horses don't have a frontal lobe, therefore they can't make those deeper connections. It's the same reason why they can't hold a grudge, because they can't connect that, that person once did something to them, and they're going to hold on to that grudge forever. That's not something their brain can do. Yeah, there were quite a few studies that I did look at that were those delayed response, put the feed in the tub, the horse watches. Will they walk to the correct tub in 5 seconds? If the release is in 10 seconds, how long can we get it? So that was a really common study that I think definitely, some of those studies were saying the horses couldn't remember after a minute, they didn't remember, and others were finding that they did after a minute they could remember. So I think it depended on the setup and the horses, and if it goes back to that mares versus geldings, do the geldings have better spatial awareness? Can they better remember which feed tub the food is in? Because that's the study that was looking at mares versus geldings. Was it set up 4 feed tubs, and only one of them you could actually easily reach. The other 3 had a breastplate or a breast bar in front of them, and so you could reach for it, but it wasn't really comfortable, and you couldn't get as much feed as you wanted. But one of the stalls had a breastplate that was far enough in you could easily access the food, and the geldings every time got it correct, where the mares didn't remember which one to go to and just would try through a process of elimination until they found the feed tub they wanted.
It's interesting because this is where I feel like there's, at least I wasn't able to really read many studies that looked at teaching horses new information across 10 minutes as what we do in our rides. I was wondering, if a horse's continuous attention span, yes, they can learn for probably a bit longer, upwards of 10 minutes, new information, but they only have that continuous attention span of, let's say, 10, 15 seconds. When we're asking them to perform a certain move, do we only have 10 to 15 seconds to ask them to perform this? And then you have to release and either give them the reward if they performed it, or just give them a break and then reattempt it?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways from that 2007 study is I think this explains Dublin a lot better. As Dublin, we were always told, didn't he didn't start back up. If you gave him a break, he had a hard time starting back up. And so you couldn't give him a break. You had to just kind of keep riding, and at the end of the ride, you could give him, right, his deserved break. The problem with that is he got grumpier and grumpier with it, and you had to be more and more careful with how you let him have a break, which, guys, I hear how stupid this sounds now, but that's what my trainers, like, that's what the well-educated people in the room were telling me. And I didn't have just one well-educated person telling me this. I had multiple very well-educated riders and trainers and instructors telling me I can't give my horse a break. I think Dublin is one of these horses that did not have a long attention span. I had about 3 minutes or less, to work, and then I had to give him a break. And then over time, we could probably have built that up to be longer, but I never realized I had to build that up. I never realized he actually did deserve that break. And I think he was one that would get so frustrated and throw these big tantrums when he didn't get a reward, because he knew he only had 15 seconds, and you had 15 seconds to figure it out or get out of his way. And he would get so frustrated with us when we couldn't figure it out. And so I think the takeaway is that we have to do a lot more interval kind of styles with our riding,
Yeah.
We cannot, back to humans can focus on a task. Yes, you have the capacity to sit and just repeat, drill, 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 drill. Horses do not have that learning capability. They've checked out after the first ask. And so you have to make sure that you've got that 10, 15 seconds to really ask and then move on to something else. You cannot drag something out for more than 15 seconds, no matter what the outcome is. And I think that's what people, again, getting stuck on that task. Well, my horse didn't do it correctly, so we're going to sit here until he does it correctly. You're not going to get there. Like, that's a fight is not the same thing as training.
Yeah, I think the interval training is a really big takeaway. And I think this is honestly kind of what we were talking about a little while ago when we were discussing, how long should we be riding our horses? And I think now we're a lot farther down that path of understanding why we have this idea in our heads of you don't need to ride for 60 minutes like we were always trained in pony club and such.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to ride for an hour for you to accomplish what you need to in your ride. And I think what the epitome of it is that do interval training, which is, work on something for 3 minutes and then take a break with the pony. Give them a reward, give them a pat, kind of disengage, let them chill for a second or two, and then pick back up, do it again, or, start working on whatever next you want to work on in your ride. And then you have like the next 3-minute interval to work in, and then stop and give your horse like a 2-minute walk break. That way they can decompress, breathe, and then come back to it. And that should take you to like 30 minutes of your ride.
And I think, if you're concerned about conditioning, that, you could do a conditioning ride that's a lot longer and a lot more intense, but your conditioning shouldn't include drilling. Like, to me, a conditioning ride, doing a lot of trot intervals, my horse has got a loose rein. Like, he's going to do what he needs with his head. He can look at that, he can look at this. It's more of that physical component to conditioning. It's not that mental training component to it.
I also started thinking about this stuff of the horse's attention span, kind of in terms of how we were looking into the studies a few weeks ago that looked at the comparison of positive reinforcement with horses with food reward versus horses with a grooming reward. And in the study, they kept noting that horses that were receiving the food reward, they were learning things a lot quicker and they had a better retention rate for whatever the handler was trying to teach them, whereas the horses that had the grooming reward weren't learning as quickly and they didn't have the same retention rate as those with the food reward. And they kind of drew this as the reward you're giving your horse helps increase their learning capabilities. But I started thinking about it in terms of, they also noted in the study that the horses that received a grooming reward were less attentive to the handlers. They were more focused on their surroundings. They were looking around a lot more. They had their sole focus on that handler, whereas the horses with the food reward were noted to have a lot more of a sole focused on that handler. And I'm assuming that increase in learning capabilities didn't necessarily come straight from that food reward. It came from that increased attention they were paying the handler who was giving them the food reward.
I mean, I know for like Addie personally, there's some skills that we're trying to learn through positive reinforcement training that only certain treats will get a result because it's not worth it. that what I'm asking is too difficult for her to do and it's not worth just a hay pellet. She needs a more interesting treat, something that tastes a little bit better. And then she'll push through whatever that difficult thing is. So it's also really important that you keep in mind that your reward cannot always be the same thing. You do have to adjust it depending on what you're asking your horse in order to make it worth their time. And that's where, positive reinforcement, you have a little bit more range. Whether you're scratching or giving a treat, you have a bit more of a range of what you can reward a horse with than just a release of pressure. Not that a release of pressure is a bad reward. It's just it's just it either is or it isn't.
You don't get to pick the reward that your horse wants, right? Mm-hmm. You don't get to tell your horse, hey, you like scratches, not food, or hey, you like carrots versus apples. You don't get to decide that for your horse. Your horse is the one deciding that.
Yes.
So you have to pick a reward that your horse actually wants.
So I purchased my first study, and it's actually not a study. It is a review of what was at that time the current scientific literature, and it has some really interesting points. They talk a lot about horses learning behavior and what they had done in this review. It's called Equine Learning Behavior, and it's by Jack Murphy and Sean Arkins from the University of Limerick, Ireland. So I think it's actually pronounced like Jack Murphy. I don't know how to say Sean Arkins. But they had they looked at a lot of the scientific research and literature that was out there that was trying to look at equine learning behaviors. And they concluded that there was some serious issues with the current research that was available. And this was done, I believe, in 2007 as well. And it was really well peer reviewed. Actually, I found at least 3 different articles or additional peer comments that people were like, this is great stuff that they're talking about. One of the comments that they found or had, I read it and was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of their conclusions after reading through the literature is, it is, however, likely that the horses with the greatest ability to learn and form and understand concepts are those which are better equipped to succeed in terms of the human-horse relationship and the contemporary training environment. So I think this is really important to keep in mind, that not all horses are open and ready to learn. Not all horses do well in a traditional training environment, and that a lot of these studies have a very fixed approach, whether it's positive reinforcement or not, have a very fixed approach. And the horses that are doing well and giving you the good results are those horses that are better suited to work with a human and to fit into that relationship. And I talk about her all the time, but that's Addie. Like, she loves humans. Where Nim, for whatever reason, whether it was via abuse or his personality or a combination of the two, learning's a lot, he doesn't love humans. So he wouldn't maybe do as well in some of these studies as Addie would. So I think that's something to really keep in mind, is that these studies are all basically skewed to favor the horses that already have a good human-horse relationship.
Yeah, and some of these studies even dismiss the horses that aren't performing well, or they dismiss horses that aren't picking up on stuff.
So I shared this with you at the beginning, but I did find a study from the 80s. It was this
oh god,
her name was what is her name? Shoot, it was her thesis, and then it got picked up. And so this is called repeatability and comparison of 2 maze tests to measure learning ability in horses. So this was published in 1982 as part of Catherine Loki's master thesis as a graduate of Texas Tech University, and she was graduating in I think animal breeding or something. But anyways, so this study had 16 horses. They were to go through a maze, and it's a simple T maze, which basically just imagine like a football goalpost. That's what this maze looks like. So the horse enters the post, the base hallway, and then they can go left or right up either arm of the goalpost. Does that make sense?
Oh, I was imagining like a T, the letter T.
So I didn't name the test. The test came named. And what the horses would do is there would be a feed tub at the end of each hallway, and one would have treats in it. And there would be like a image. I don't know if it was like a tarp, if it was a colored piece of plywood, but that would be indicating which way the feed tub was on. And so they did a bunch of conditioning for the horses to get them used to it. But this is... what I really enjoyed about this study the most was that they started with 16 horses, but only 13 horses completed the test. One 6-year-old mare died during the test, And again, it's a hallway with feet in it, so I don't know.
How did she die?
Exactly. I don't know. And
Did they not give any more information on that? Because I feel like that should have been explained.
Not that I found, but they were feeding. The test was a bit intensive, and that's something that Irish review pointed out, is that the number of trials these horses have to go through in a day is sometimes excessive. You just mentioned one where it was 40 trials. This one was 20 trials for 20 days, and that's not actually a good learning a way for a horse to learn, that you're not actually measuring the horse's learning ability by repeating these many trials and having it set up the way they are. But anyway, so 6-year-old mare died during the test. No explanation as to why, but they were using oats covered in molasses, and I imagine after 20 trials in 20 days, maybe we could blame the oats, but I don't know. One of these was removed due to extreme emotional behavior in the maze. So this was a 2-year-old. A 2-year-old was removed because of extreme emotional behavior.
That's not funny. That's so sad, but that's also a little funny.
I just imagine him having like a meltdown and bucking and like rearing and just like going crazy in the maze.
I'm not having a good time.
And the other one, actually, those are both yearlings, not 2-year-olds. But so 1 yearling for extremely emotional behavior. And the second yearling was removed because there was no evidence of learning. Basically, he was too stupid to move forward with the tests.
Oh, that poor baby.
So they went ahead with 13 animals. The point being is that those animals weren't maybe the ones that were going to learn in a traditional manner. And I think these were all quarter horses as well. Yay, Texas. I don't think that these horses were set up, for whatever reason, the kind that were going to do well anyways. So this test already eliminated those that were going to do poorly. The horse dying, I don't know why she died again. It probably wasn't because she had extremely emotional behavior. It was probably something else. That's the point, is that those horses may not even make it into the test, right? You're going to get horses that can learn in a traditional learning environment, and you're not going to take horses that are challenges into these experiments. So the only other thing that I can mention in this one is that we've started to notice a pattern, and it definitely was evident in that 2007 French test, is that horses are starting. You'll notice this in a lot of tests, that they do worse in the second test or the third test than they did in the first test. And this has to do with, as I mentioned, this is not the best learning environment for a horse. That the reason the horses are doing worse in those second tests is because you're not actually measuring their learning ability. You're not actually teaching them in an efficient way. And I don't know what that alternative looks like or how you go about adjusting that, but that was one of the other things that was noted, is that these test 2s, test 3s are showing worse results because of the challenges with how they're actually setting up the tests.
Interesting. It makes you question, at least, how applicable actually are these tests to your horse and how you're interacting versus in like a stressful testing environment. It's like the whole thing with the horses swallowing, where they had like a camera in their mouth and a bit, and they had side reins on attached, and they were on a treadmill. How applicable is that to your horse that you're riding,
But I think the takeaway is that drilling your horse does not work. That is not how horses learn. You cannot repeat the same thing over and over and over and over and over again and think you're going to be better tomorrow. You have to mix it up more. Horses have short attention spans. You have to keep things moving and progressing, and you can circle back through, try it again later, but you cannot get stuck on repeat, or it's not, Groundhog's Day. Like, you cannot do that for your horse, because that's not how they learn.
I think my thing that I'm going to take away from this all, and I think everyone should take away from this, and we all should go do, is we should all do that laser study all on our own ponies and see what our horses' attention spans are. Because I am totally going to go do that tomorrow and see which one of my ponies has a longer attention span or even cares about a laser dot. And I'm super excited just to see, because that's just something I can actually, see with my own horse. Like, that's something that I can get an idea of my own horse's attention span and take that into our next training sessions and take that into consideration in the future when I'm working with them.
I think that's a very good idea, that we all need our own lasers and we need to practice laser tag with our ponies and see how good of a players they can be.
Thank you so much for sticking with us through this episode. I hope you learned something about your horse's attention span potentially, and I hope every single one of you is about ready to go out there and do the little, attention span test with your horse with a laser beam on the wall. If you have questions, comments, concerns, you can reach out to us on Instagrams at inthebarn.pod, or you can send us an email at mudstudsskullcaps@gmail.com.
Thanks, guys, and don't forget to leave a review on that Apple Podcast app. We really appreciate it.
Remember to stay safe, stay classy, and stay in the saddle.